Hello, I'm Claire Smith and welcome to my channel. So today's video is going to be another one in my What Were We Wearing series. So I'm going to take a nostalgic look back through perfume history and talk about the fragrances that we were wearing 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 and even 30 years ago. So if you haven't seen me before, I'm Claire Smith. I make videos all about perfume, perfume science, perfume history, perfume psychology, and I also just do some straight perfume reviews and also fun perfume tags. So if that kind of thing interests you and you haven't already done so, then please do consider subscribing, and also please like this video if you do end up liking this content. So I made one of these videos about a year ago and I talked about the fragrances going back from 2023. So today's video is going to be a little bit different because we're in a new year. So let's start off with 30 years ago and see what we were wearing back in 1994. So the big news in 1994 was the election in South Africa of Nelson Mandela as president in the country's first multiracial elections. The US, meanwhile, was transfixed by accusations against O.J. Simpson, who was accused of having murdered his ex-wife and also his ex-wife's partner. And also Kurt Cobain had been found dead, the frontman of Nirvana. And in the UK, Sunday trading had suddenly become legal, which to me seems really ridiculous now to think of shops being closed on Sundays. But yeah, that was a thing. In cinemas, 1994 was an excellent year for film, and we were watching Forrest Run in Forrest Gump. We were also watching John Travolta and Uma Thurman dancing in Pulp Fiction. But truly, the smash hit film of the year was Four Weddings and a Funeral, and that meant that we were all also listening to Wet 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 on repeat with Love Is All Around. But what was going on in the world of fragrance in 1994? Well, the biggest release of the year was really CK1, and that was an immediate and very successful hit for Calvin Klein. So actually, Calvin Klein took $5 million on the CK1 fragrance in the first 10 days of release alone, and it became a bestseller and continued to be a bestseller way into the 2000s. Really, CK1 was one of the first big unisex fragrance releases, and it really had a very powerful message behind it, that it was for everybody. And the advertising campaign featured some very different looking models to what had been seen previously in magazine advertising for fragrances. They featured models such as Kate Moss, and that really gave the fragrance a very different and very modern feeling identity, and it made it very cool, and it made people want to try it and want to smell it. And CK1 really summed up the freshy trend of the 90s. Other releases in 1994 really clash very strongly with CK1 and really show just how different CK1 was. But really, one of the biggest releases of that year was Cacharel's Eden. So Eden is a green, slightly herbal feeling floral fragrance. It's quite loud, it's quite brash and in your face. And it's something that really sort of harks back almost to the 80s, really. It's something that would fit in very well in the 80s. And that fragrance really just shows the very different styles that were around at the time. Other releases back in 1994 included Dior's Tendre Poison, and that fragrance I think is still very loved, and it's very, very expensive now because it's been discontinued, but I would have loved to have tried that one. Also released in 1994 was Rochas Tocade, which I think is meant to be a rose floral kind of fragrance, but with some really warm amber and vanilla. And I haven't tried that one either, but looking at the bottle, it always makes me think that it's a lot older than 1994. The bottle makes me think of 1980s catalogue clothing almost. It's sort of got this kind of block colour, polo neck kind of look to the bottle. Almost like something from the late 80s. And yeah, I'm intrigued by that fragrance, but I've never got to try it. So yeah, that's 1994. Not too much that I recognise there. And actually checking my own collection, I realised I've never actually owned a fragrance from 1994. I've owned fragrances from 1993, 1995, never from 1994. Clearly that year in fragrance passed me by. So next, let's go back 25 years ago to 1999. So I remember 1999 not really being about 1999. It was about waiting for 2000. It was all about the planning going into the millennium. So things like the Millennium Bug were really a talking point. Also the Millennium Dome being built and also the Millennium Wheel being built. But really, 1999 was quite an important year just on its own, because in South Africa, President Mandela had stepped down. In the US, President Clinton's impeachment trial had resulted in his acquittal. And in the UK, we suddenly have devolved governments in Scotland and in Wales. And actually also in the UK that year, there was a total solar eclipse. And I remember watching this solar eclipse from my garden and thinking, I'm never going to see this in my lifetime again. So actually, because of the millennium being so close, films like The Matrix were incredibly popular in 1999, but we were also watching films such as Notting Hill and also The Mummy. So music-wise, I remember I was listening to Californication by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. That album, I could probably still sing it word for word. I was that obsessed with it. So which fragrances were new to the market 25 years ago, back in 1999? Well, I've realised that I do have quite a few in my collection that are from that year, weirdly. And the first one is J'adore by Dior. So this fragrance, it was marketed by Charlize Theron. All the adverts, I think, ever since it was released, featured Charlize Theron. And it always makes me think of her when I see the bottle, because she wears that kind of neck decoration that reflects the top on this bottle. So this is a watery floral fragrance. It has watery jasmine, watery lily of the valley, and also some watery fruits in there as well. So it's got the watery melon and also the pear. It's just a very kind of easygoing floral fragrance, but yeah, definitely of the late 90s and very typical of the time. So that's J'adore. I also have this empty bottle of Gucci Rush, so I've finished this one. So this is the first fragrance that was released under Tom Ford's directorship of Gucci at the time. And this fragrance really reflects that kind of futurism that was a trend in 1999 with looking forward to the millennium. This fragrance just stands out because of the packaging. It's not in a glass bottle, it's in a plastic container. It's something that really makes you just want to pick it up and try it. And it does have this kind of slightly plasticky feel to it. It's a very distinctive, very interesting, slightly plasticky peach fragrance, but with some smooth white florals as well. And then also some kind of undertone, some earthy undertone of the coriander and also the patchouli. And I think this fragrance was something that a lot of people loved. I think this was a lot of people's signature fragrance because it is so distinctive and it is so different. So that's Gucci Rush. Another fragrance that I own from 1999 is also very futuristic looking. It looks like an alien spaceship to me. And this one is Ultraviolet by Paco Rabanne. And I'm not a huge fan of Paco Rabanne fragrances, but this one, I don't know, there's something about it. There's something nostalgic about it that I really like. It's so full of contrast. So it starts off kind of spicy, even a little bit hot. And then as it dries down, it turns into this fuzzy, soft, but warm violet fragrance with the patchouli in the background. Just very distinctive, very long lasting, and again, very of its time. So that's Paco Rabanne's Ultraviolet. It seems like 1999 was a good year in fragrance because there were loads of other releases that were really big on the market as well, such as Chanel's Allure and also Elizabeth Arden's Green Tea, which I think is still very much loved today. So next, we're up to 20 years ago, so 2004, and I remember I'd just left uni, and at the time, a Harvard University student, Mark Zuckerberg, was setting up the first social network for university students, and he called it The Facebook. I wonder where that went. In the US at the time, George W. Bush was being elected for a second term in office, and Tony Blair had just announced in the UK that he was going to stand for a third time in a third election as Prime Minister. Back in 2004, we were listening to songs such as Cool on Me. I remember that being a huge, huge hit, and also Natasha Bedingfield's These Words. At the cinema, we were watching Jim Carrey decide whether or not to erase the memory of Kate Winslet from his mind in The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. We were also crying at The Notebook and also finally watching Uma Thurman Kill Bill. So back in 2004, 20 years ago, what were the new fragrances on the market? Which fragrances had just been released? Well, really the most famous one, I think, is probably DKNY's Be Delicious. I remember wearing that one as my signature fragrance for a few years after it was released, and I absolutely love that fragrance. So if you haven't tried it, it's in an apple bottle, and it's an apple-based fragrance, although it's quite cucumbery as well. It's quite green, quite watery, quite aquatic, but also a little bit soapy as well. And I think that I wore that for a few years, actually. But it's something that I do wonder, if I went back to it, would I actually enjoy it as much nowadays? Another fragrance released in 2004, which I don't think is really talked about very much anymore, but I was kind of pleased to try this one, is YSL Cinema. So YSL fragrances you generally think of as quite big fragrances, quite heavy hitters, quite in your face. This one isn't that. This one's quite intimate and quite close to skin almost, but also very comforting and very enveloping. It's quite a huggy one, this one. So this is a really rich, powdery vanilla fragrance with a really soft, fluffy jasmine in it, but also some fruits as well. So there's apricot, I think, and there's just a slightly orangey feel as well at points in this fragrance, but very, very gentle, very soft orange. This one I really enjoyed, and I think it's something that you don't see in shops anymore. I don't know whether it's discontinued. I think it is still available actually online from the YSL website, but I'm not sure whether it's been reformulated or not. I did really enjoy this one, and yeah, it's got that kind of fluffy vanillic feel that was coming in the early 2000s. I think this was really a sign of things to come. So that's YSL Cinema. Another fragrance released in 2004 is Versace's Crystal Noir, and this fragrance really has a very mixed reaction. Something that's really love or hate. There's not much in between with this one because it is so distinctive. And I have the EDT version. I think there's a great debate, isn't there, about which one to get. I remember having this debate myself when I was choosing a couple of years ago, and I went for the EDT in the end because I just couldn't find the EDP at the time. But this one is a cool, spicy feeling, but kind of creamy sandalwood fragrance. It has sort of a feeling of a sun cream, almost an old-fashioned sun cream. And I think that's just a very love or hate kind of DNA, isn't it, really? This one, it lasts the whole day. I can spray this on in the morning. I'll probably still smell it a couple of days later. It's really, really strong. For an EDT, this is an everlasting and very strongly projecting fragrance. You really don't need many sprays of this one. So that's Versace Crystal Noir. So another fragrance from 2004 is this one from Prada. So I think this was originally called Prada, but they later renamed it Prada Amber. But this also has a lot of patchouli. It still is quite a resinous, vanillic fragrance overall. I think this one's been compared to Chanel's Coromandel, and I've tried that fragrance a few times. And yeah, there's definitely a resemblance there, but I wouldn't say they're spot on dupes or anything. But this one's been discontinued now, sadly, anyway, and I think it goes for hundreds of pounds these days. So I won't be buying another bottle, but yeah, Prada Amber I really used to like. Also released in 2004 was Dior's Pure Poison, which is a fragrance that is on my wish list. I absolutely love Pure Poison by Dior. And also Britney Spears released her first celebrity fragrance, Curious. So next, let's go back to 15 years ago, 2009. And I remember I was working as a research assistant and I was having loads of fun. I was in my mid-20s and I was going out loads. I just had such a social life and probably one of the best sort of periods of my life, really. I think also 2009 was just a huge contrast with that kind of fun time in my life, because 2009 was just after the financial crash of 2008, wasn't it? And it was really the time when everything was hitting. So unemployment was getting much higher. Also, there were loads of shop closures, loads of businesses went under in 2009. And also house prices were crashing too. So a lot of people were having a really hard time in 2009. 2009 was just a very strange year because Michael Jackson died and also Patrick Swayze died. And I think they were two people that we didn't really expect to be saying goodbye to quite so soon. Also, Rage Against the Machine got to #1 at Christmas in the UK, which was very strange. In the cinema at the time, we were watching films such as 500 Days of Summer with Joseph Gordon-Levitt trying to work out exactly what's gone wrong with his relationship. And we were also listening to things like Black Eyed Peas, Lady Gaga and Beyonce. So back in 2009, what were the big perfume releases of that year? Well, I think the one in my collection that really stands out to me as something that's really stood the test of time is L'Impératrice by Dolce & Gabbana. So this was originally from a range of fragrances and they all had different numbers. L'Impératrice was number 3 and they were based on tarot cards, I think, and they all had an associated model or group of models. And I remember number 3 was Naomi Campbell, and it's really the only fragrance in this range that survived this long. This one's still going 15 years later. And this fragrance is just a very distinctive kind of fruity musk fragrance. So this is rhubarb, it's also watermelon and it's kiwi, and the dry down is quite a laundry musk along with those fruits. But yeah, this one's just that kind of very typical recommendation, isn't it, for a summer fragrance. It's just very refreshing and just very zingy and tart, and it's just quite different to a lot of fragrances, which I think is why it gets recommended quite so much. So yeah, that's L'Impératrice. I think it was a bit of a sleeper hit, this one. So another fragrance from 2009 is Nina Ricci's Ricci, and this again has rhubarb, but it's very different to L'Impératrice. This here, the rhubarb isn't quite so tart. It's mixed in with a really sweet syrupy rose and also some patchouli. This is really a patchouli fragrance, and this was really the beginning or even the middle of this patchouli trend, which continued way into the 2010s. This is just quite sweet and also quite boozy smelling. I think this one always makes me think of some kind of liqueur almost, is how I describe this fragrance. So Ricci, sadly discontinued, hard to find now I think, but I'm going to enjoy the rest of my bottle. I think in 2009 there were quite a few big fragrances, and really the ones that have stood the test of time for me are things like Bal d'Afrique, which is still incredibly popular and really is quite a freshie to begin with, but it dries down to quite a creamy fig fragrance really in the end. Even though fig I don't think is a listed note, it is very distinctively figgy by the end of it. I think also the fragrance that stands out from 2009 for me is Van Cleef and Arpels Orchidee Vanille, which I think is incredibly loved, that fragrance. So that's a powdery vanilla with kind of almost chocolatey touches to it and also an orangey feel as well. But the vanilla there is more of a floral vanilla. It's more of the idea of the orchid flower itself rather than the actual idea of pure vanilla. So yeah, that fragrance was also a big hit from 2009. So next, let's go back 10 years to 2014. And actually the big news where I live in Yorkshire, the big news was that the Tour de France was going to start in Leeds. The whole of Yorkshire went Tour de France mad. There were bikes absolutely everywhere, decorating every building almost, it felt like. And there was just a load of excitement over the Tour de France starting in Yorkshire. So the other big news for the UK was that Scotland voted to stay as part of the UK and not separate into a different country. And for the rest of the world, I think the biggest news of the year was really the Ebola outbreak in Africa at the time. In 2014 in cinemas, we were watching films about geniuses. So, for example, The Theory of Everything came out, which was a film about Stephen Hawking. And we also had The Imitation Game, which talked about the breaking of the Enigma code by Alan Turing and his team. I think in the world of music, we were listening to Pharrell Williams talk about how happy he is, and also Meghan Trainor singing all about that bass. So which fragrances were new on the perfume shelves in 2014? Well, little did I know, but I was going to go into a department store in 2014 and smell a new fragrance from YSL and fall in love with it. And this one was Black Opium. Little did I know that the rest of the world was probably going to do the same, because I think a lot of people bought this fragrance around the mid-2010s. Also released in 2014 is Guerlain's ultimate summer fragrance, Terracotta. So this is a white and yellow floral, a white and yellow sunny floral fragrance with a real rich feeling in the background. This really makes me think of sun creams, actually, 1980s sun creams. I find this one just addictive, and it's just one of my favourites in my collection, I think. And I can really see why this one's still around 10 years later, because it is just so good. So that's Terracotta. Also released in 2014 was Velvet Orchid, and this is a flanker of Black Orchid. So Velvet Orchid, I think, was a lot easier for most people to wear, and it's a fragrance that I think just is sweeter, it's creamier, it's more spring-like because it's got bulb flowers, and the sweetness in this is slightly different to the sweetness that's in Black Orchid. This is more of a honeyed sweetness, whereas Black Orchid is more of a rich vanillic sweetness, I think, overall. So this one was also released in 2014. So that's Velvet Orchid by Tom Ford. Also released in 2014 was Lancome's Oud Bouquet, which is a beautiful fragrance in itself. But also, I think that fragrance really spawned the whole kind of Middle Eastern clone house craze really on YouTube, because that fragrance really inspired Swiss Arabian Shaghaf Oud, and that really got some kind of traction on YouTube. And I think that fragrance really introduced a lot of people to clone house Middle Eastern fragrance brands that wouldn't ever have thought to look at those brands before, because of the poor availability and the high price point of Oud Bouquet. So finally, let's go just 5 years back to 2019, and we didn't know what was coming in 2019, did we? But really, 2019 itself was still quite a turbulent year, and really that was across the globe. So in the US, we had Donald Trump undergoing his first impeachment proceedings against him. Also in France, we had Notre Dame burning down before our eyes in April. There was unrest in Hong Kong as well. We saw lots of protests against the government in Hong Kong. In the UK, we had that strange period of time around the election in December, the decisions around Brexit. It was just a very strange and very strained time politically. And actually, when I think back to what I was watching in 2019, I was actually watching a lot of documentaries. I remember watching Toxic Beauty, for example, which is a film about really, standards in the beauty industry and really what they put in beauty products, which I think was a topic that was concerning a lot of people at the time. I think I was also watching comedies in 2019. So I remember watching the second series of Fleabag, which I think a lot of people watched in 2019. So what were the hot new fragrance releases back in 2019? Well, I think the biggest one that stands out for me is Jean Paul Gaultier's La Belle. I think that was the one that was not expected to be a hit, but just seemed to capture people's hearts, really. It's a fragrance that I never really gelled with, but I think the thing that really intrigued people with that fragrance was the fact that Jean Paul Gaultier were concealing a lot of the notes. They only really declared 3 notes of that fragrance, and we all knew there was more going on than what they were saying. And I think that made people intrigued by it, but also that was a fragrance that was formulated in part by Quentin Biche. And I think Quentin Biche has been riding high at least over these last 5 years, perhaps even a little bit longer, perhaps over the last 10 years. I think that was really part of that bulk of work that he's done that's meant that he's had lots and lots of hits in a very small time period. Another fragrance from 2019 that was really an unexpected hit was Moschino's Toy Boy. So if you haven't spelled Toy Boy, I best describe it as a chemical weapon made with rose. It's a very, very peppery rose in the dry down, but it does start out with a blast of citrus as well. So yeah, I really fully understand the split opinions on that one, because it is such a strange, almost otherworldly kind of rose fragrance. Another interesting release from 2019 was Gucci's Memoire d'une Odeur, or more commonly known as Memoir, because that name is really quite a mouthful. But the interesting thing about Gucci Memoir was that Gucci were daring enough to market that fragrance as a unisex fragrance. And that's something that's unusual, even today, 5 years on. So I don't know how Gucci did with Memoir. I get the impression it wasn't successful. But I went to try it, and I remember thinking that it was a very unusual fragrance. So it opens with a really almost plasticky blast of bitter almond, but then it dries down into this powdery, pollen-y feeling chamomile fragrance. And it's very, very different in the dry down. Another release in 2019 is a very interesting fragrance from Kilian, and this one's Rolling in Love. So Rolling in Love was a very, very different direction for fragrance at the time. So Rolling in Love is a soft, almondy, musky amberette fragrance, and it's just very close to skin and very intimate. And I think some people got it and some people didn't. And I think this fragrance still massively divides opinions. So that's Rolling in Love. Other fragrances released in 2019 include Valentino's Born in Roma, which I think is probably one of the most popular designer fragrances today. Also, there are a few discontinued gems that were released in 2019. So, for example, Whispers in the Library by Maison Margiela was released in 2019. And that's a kind of bookish, papery fragrance, papery vanilla, woody vanilla fragrance, really. But I think that one's really special, and I'm really sad that one's gone. And another fragrance from 2019 that is sadly discontinued, but I think is very, very missed, is Coconut Fizz. So Coconut Fizz is from the Aqua Allegoria line from Guerlain. And I think Guerlain are just a bit quick on the trigger, aren't they, with their discontinuations? They're just very quick on the turnover of their fragrances. But this one had just got popular and they just got rid of it. So yeah, I think this one's really missed, and it's my fragrance of the day today. So that's the final fragrance in this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have enjoyed it, then please press the like button, and please also consider subscribing if you haven't done already. And please let me know, is there a particular fragrance in your life that really makes you think of a particular time in your life? And do you actually remember any of the fragrances I've mentioned in this video? Does it bring back memories from those particular years? I'd love to know what you think. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.